Welcome to History Sleuth, a podcast exploring the involvement of history and culture and current events. Today I wanted to talk about the 1776 Commission, this project that was announced at the White House Conference on American History recently. There's a lot to unpack here, and I expect this won't be the only episode that I record on this, if we get more information about it, if stuff starts to actually happen, and so I'll tell you what I've got right now, but expect updates, I suppose. But before we get into all of that, if you're on Twitter, follow me at Sleuth History to get updates about when I post new episodes and continue the discussion started in this podcast. I think it's really important to continue to ask questions of what we think we know about history. And so that's something we can continue to do there. I'm just a college student, a history major, so I'm not an expert on anything. I'm just a curious student with access to Google. So today we're looking at the 1776 Commission, which President Trump announced recently. It's supposed to be this initiative to teach patriotic American history. Kind of in contrast, it's presented to the 1619 Project, which was a project done by the New York Times that discussed the history of slavery in America. I've done a couple episodes on the 1619 Project already. I think it's the 3rd and the 11th episodes of History Sleuth, so definitely check those out if you want more of my opinions on that. Also, when this new project, the 1776 Commission, was announced, History Twitter absolutely blew up, and so I have some of those reactions to look at the end, because there's a lot of people on Twitter a lot smarter than me, and they made some good points. So, a Forbes article written by Andrew Solander covered this announcement, and Solander says President Trump on Thursday announced several measures aimed at promoting what he called, quote, patriotic education, while blasting progressive efforts at re-examining American history through a race-critical lens as, quote, toxic propaganda. At the White House Conference on American History, Trump took aim at the 1619 Project, a series of essays in the New York Times re-examining America's legacy of slavery, which has become a common foil for right-wing politicians, calling it the ideological poison that will dissolve the civic bonds of America. Trump also called out what he said is left-wing indoctrination in schools and curriculum, which he claimed, quote, views every issue through the lens of race, end quote, in an effort to impose tyranny and a new segregation. Those are both quotes as well. Trump instead proposed, quote, patriotic education, applauding a grant awarded by the National Endowment for the Humanities to develop, in his words, quote, a pro-American curriculum that celebrates the truth about our nation's great history. Trump also announced that he will sign an executive order establishing a commission to, quote, promote patriotic education, which will be called the 1776 Commission, in contrast with the 1619 Project. A quote that Solander pulled from Trump's announcement on this that he thought was important was, the narratives about America being pushed by the far left and being chanted in the streets bear a striking resemblance to the anti-American propaganda of our adversaries, Trump said, alleging both groups want to see America weakened, derided, and totally diminished. And then he also has a critic here, an important note that as President Trump gears up to attack the 1619 Project, author Nicole Hannah-Jones is a national treasure who put in context how America came to be, the black enslaved people it exploited, and the way forward, tweeted PBS News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor. We should all be grateful for the 1619 Project. Okay, so that was the article from Forbes. There's a lot here already to unpack. I think it's interesting that every time patriotic education was mentioned, that was in quotes. And I think that's an interesting place to start. Like, is education ever actually patriotic? Was it ever patriotic in the first place? And should it be? There's something kind of, I don't know the good word for it. Not threatening, but it does seem to be like a nice way to really be saying something else. I don't like the idea of a patriotic education. I think it's interesting, too, that the 1619 Project is called toxic propaganda and ideological poison. There are, I had my critiques for the 1619 Project as well that I expressed already on this podcast, but I never called it ideological poison or toxic propaganda, nothing close to that. I don't think, as far as a work of history goes, I don't think it's very well done as a work of history, but I think it does pull from an important piece of history, that is American slavery, that we don't spend a lot of time focusing on. And it draws attention to that in a way that people haven't before. And that's really super important, I think. We don't talk enough about the history of American slavery. And it's a uncomfortable, ugly part of American history, right? So I think it's all the more important that we do talk about it more and familiarize ourselves with it, so that when Americans come face to face with this part of our history, they don't immediately think that it's poison or propaganda or toxic or different things like that, or an attempt to bring America down. I think if we truly understand the history of American slavery, we can rejoice that that is no longer what our country looks like to that degree. But we can also see there the work that we have ahead of us in building a country that truly represents equality and freedom for everyone, that we have a lot. Like, we started from a place where that was not the case, and we're working our way up still. That's the kind of narrative about America that I think, in brief terms, that we should be telling, but that clearly makes people uncomfortable. And the idea that teaching American history is anti-American, I think, is a really frightening idea to put forth as well. And that's not something I want to brush by. I'm not sure really what to say more about that. But I have another article here from CBS News also about President Trump's comments. So CBS News says, President Trump is weighing in on history, blasting the New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project, which reframes American history by focusing on the consequences of slavery and contributions of Black Americans, and at the same time announcing the creation of the new 1776 Commission to reinstate, quote, patriotism in American schools. Quote, the left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies. There is no better example than the New York Times totally discredited 1619 Project, Mr. Trump said at the event. This project rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth, the president continued. America's founding set in motion the unstoppable chain of events that abolished slavery, secured civil rights, defeated communism and fascism, and built the most fair, equal, and prosperous nation in human history, end quote. Some of America's founding fathers, like George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, were slave owners whose properties depended on slave labor. Slavery was also enshrined in the Constitution with the Three-Fifths Compromise, which said 3/5 of the slave population would be counted for the purpose of determining direct taxation and the representation in the House of Representatives. So that last paragraph I read right there after President Trump's remarks is really funny to me. I feel like that was a good placement by this news writer. Okay, so this podcast is about history and seeking truth and justice. So even though politics seems to come up a lot, it is not my intention to focus on that. So I'm going to ignore that first part of Trump's comments where he said the left did this. Whatever that means. But Trump claims that the 1619 Project rewrote American history to say that our country was founded on oppression rather than freedom. I've done a few episodes on the 1619 Project, like I said, and while it definitely does have its flaws, like a piece of historical work, it's not filled with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies, and does not rewrite American history. I think actually the opposite is true, right? The rewriting of American history would be to say that our country was founded in freedom and not oppression. While freedom was an ideal spoken of by the people we call our founding fathers, that was not something in practice that every single American experienced, not while slavery was a legal institution in our country, right? Really, really interesting. As this article pointed out in the well-placed paragraph for context, slavery was a part of early American society, including in the lives of the founding fathers. I want to talk about the quote, too, where Trump says, America's founding set in motion the unstoppable chain of events that abolished slavery, secured civil rights, defeated communism and fascism, and built the most fair, equal, and prosperous nation in human history. Okay, first, no historical event was unstoppable, according to those of us who believe in free will and personal responsibility. Just like we make choices now that affect people around us in big or small ways, people in the past made choices, and the consequences of those choices are still with us today in big or small ways. And so to say that it was inevitable that slavery would be abolished, or that America set in motion the events that would lead to the abolishment of slavery, like all of that is wrong. I was going to try to beat around the bush, but it's just wrong. It suggests this idea that like people don't have personal responsibility to work in their own time against injustice. And it discounts the people who were working against injustice, the abolitionists in the 17 and 1800s. And it discounts those people. And I think it discounts our opportunities today that we have to advocate for people and to seek justice. To suggest that any historical event is unstoppable or inevitable, or even the phrase like the people who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it, even that kind of leans into this idea too that we are outside of history somehow, that history happens in a vacuum, or it's like a story where the end is already written. That is not the case. Slavery was never guaranteed to have an end, right? And slavery was never, it didn't have to happen either. Those were choices that people made. People chose to enslave other people. They chose to make it a legal and acceptable institution. And then they chose to undo that. And so this is kind of what I'm talking about with like the choices that people make affect us too, because now we have the choices to, or we have the opportunities to continue to undo the institutions of racism that our country is facing today. And so our understanding of the world around us today begins right here with the understanding of America's founding. And if we are already getting things wrong about what we have control over and what we don't, it does not bode well. Okay, sorry, that was just a few words. So moving on, Trump claims that America's founding abolished slavery, secured civil rights, and defeated communism and fascism. The founding of America did none of those things. Okay, eventually, yes, slavery in America was abolished and the work of securing civil rights for all people was started, though I think it's not a far reach for me to argue that that is still ongoing. But none of that happened at the founding of America. I would like to point to as well, I did in one of my episodes, I think it was episode like 13 or something. Wait, let me look. Yeah, okay. So when I went through a bunch of like Twitter takes on history, I came across this one PragerU video that Bad History Takes had retweeted about the Three-Fifths Compromise. And they were trying to say that the Three-Fifths Compromise actually was against slavery, which is a wacky thing, right? So the Three-Fifths Compromise said that enslaved people only counted as 3/5 of a person when counting populations to determine how many representatives each state got. So it was kind of a way of limiting the political power of the South without completely discounting enslaved people as people. So like the northern states didn't want to count them as people at all, and the southern states did want to count them as people because they wanted that political power. And PragerU was trying to argue that like the Three-Fifths Compromise actually validated the fact that enslaved people were people. It was kind of wacky. They were really playing with the language. But kind of what I got from it was that it was all about politics. The Three-Fifths Compromise had nothing to do with the abolition of slavery or the maintaining of the institution of slavery. It was enslaved people were being used as political pawns by both the northern states and the southern states, no matter if they had slaves themselves or not. And so with that in the very midst of America's founding, I think that's a good example of just how, normalized slavery was. There wasn't any unstoppable chain of events that led to the abolition of slavery. They very much were not dealing with slavery. They purposefully were not dealing with slavery at the founding of America because they knew that was going to be a difficult issue. And I mean, fair enough, I guess. We ended up having a whole war about it, but anyway. So then in Trump's statement, he also said something about defeating communism and fascism at America's founding. And I could try and interpret what he meant by that, because it's probably relating to like World War II or the Cold War or something. That's usually when we talk about those things. Neither of which, remember, happened at America's founding. But when it comes down to it, you can't physically fight ideological or political concepts, so it's probably nonsense anyway. And I learned my lesson after doing that episode on Make America Great Again, so I'm just going to move on. In the CBS News, here's another quote from them. Mr. Trump also called critical race theory a, quote, Marxist doctrine, claiming that, quote, teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of those words. The president also announced on Thursday that he's launching a commission intended to reinstate patriotic education curriculum in America's schools. Okay, so I probably would have skipped over this part because we already talked about the commission, patriotic education, kind of questionable. But he said that this was child abuse. And not just that, but child abuse in the truest sense of those words. That's horrifying. To compare anything other than actual child abuse to child abuse is abhorrent, especially when it's something like this. That's really disgusting to me, and I don't want that to be glanced over either, but I also don't have anything else that I want to say about that. So back to the article. CBS News says the only path to national unity, this is a quote from the president, the only path to national unity is through our shared identity as Americans. That is why it is so urgent that we finally restore patriotic education to our schools, Mr. Trump said. Under our leadership, the National Endowment for the Humanities has awarded a grant to support the development of a pro-American curriculum that celebrates the truth about our nation's great history. Mr. Trump signed an executive order, quote, establishing a national commission to promote patriotic education by saying it would be called the 1776 Commission. Okay, so there's a lot of things here. I pulled a few words in my notes. I just put discuss this. I listed a bunch of words, and these words are patriotism, education, pro-American, and celebrating truth. There's a lot of things here, and I don't think they necessarily go together, which is why I think it's a little bit tricky here. So the patriotism and pro-American part, those go together. But I think it could be argued, too, that patriotism, loving your country well, isn't necessarily ignoring whatever flaws and icky parts of the past that it has. I've said this before, but I don't think you can love something well and not acknowledge its flaws. That's why I did an episode about incidents of racism at my university. Sorry to keep plugging episodes of my podcast, but I've made a lot of them now, and they all kind of connect. A couple episodes ago, I talked about racist incidents at the school that I attend, incidents that have happened since I have been here. And that was not fun, let me tell you. But I love my school, and that is why I researched that and created an episode and put it out there for people to listen to, because I love my school and I love my community, and I want it to be better. I want it to be a place where all people are welcome and where people are safe from racism. That's not really what it is right now. And so I think when we look at America as a whole, to be patriotic, I don't think the only way to be patriotic is to be like, oh, America's the best. America's better than everybody else. America doesn't have any problems at all. I think right now patriotism is associated with only people that say stuff like that, and I don't like that. Okay, and then the education and celebrating truth parts of that. I don't think education should have anything to do with being pro-American or being patriotic. I mean, maybe if we're getting a full understanding of the pros and cons of America, like maybe if that's the kind of patriotism we're doing, then maybe our education is patriotic. That makes me nervous. And then celebrating truth. Truth is not just the stuff that you want to hear. Truth is the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's not just the positive qualities or this mythology that we've created about American history. I don't want the founding of America to suffer from the same kinds of things that the Civil War does with the lost cause ideology, another thing that I mention all the time on this podcast. But basically, like, there's this mythology about the Civil War that still persists into today, and we're already suffering enough from that one. We don't need America's founding to suffer from that too. Man, that's so upsetting. There's a lot of things here that make me nervous. Let's finish up the article, though, and we'll look at what the smarter people have to say. New York Times spokesperson Danielle Rhodes-Ha responded to the president's remarks by saying the company is, quote, proud of the project, quote, and will continue this vital journalism. The 1619 Project is landmark, groundbreaking journalism, Rhodes-Ha said. It deepened many readers' understanding of the nation's past and forced an important conversation about the lingering effects of slavery and its centrality to America's story. We are proud of it and will continue this vital journalism. I think that's good. I think it's so interesting the kinds of effects the 1619 Project has had on politicians mostly. I think every time I've mentioned it since I reviewed it myself, it's been politicians who've had some kind of issue with it. When really all it's doing is saying, hey, slavery happened and it affects our country now. I did not realize that would be such a polarizing thing. Yeah, maybe I should look more into it myself. Maybe I'll do that. Okay, let's move on to reactions from people smarter than me on Twitter about this thing. Some of them are very funny, and some of them are funny and good. So from, I'm going to butcher your name. I'm sorry. From Stephen Leckies said, he tweeted, I agree, actually. Let's talk more about 1776. Widespread rioting, protests, property destruction, law breaking, civil disobedience, vandalism. I even hear there were some unkind words exchanged and people got their feelings hurt. That one is just a rumor, though. So that's kind of funny. I do think it's interesting that lots of people have issues with protesting and things today, even peaceful protesting today, and will hold on to this mythologized view of America's founding without realizing that too erupted from a lot of protests, way more violent than the kind of protests we're seeing today from Black Lives Matter. Most of those, 97% of those, are peaceful. Okay, another quote from Dr. Karen L. Cox. She said, U.S. historian here. I woke up this morning, as I do every morning, and I did not once think about how I could teach hatred for America. And I'm not ceding ground to those who think I do. My patriotism is not grounded in nostalgia and hagiography, but the truth, warts and all. I actually don't know what that one word means, or if I'm even saying it right. Hagiography. Let me look that up. I think that was a really good point, though. I don't think teaching truth has anything to do with hatred of your country. Truth is not motivated by hatred. If we wanted to hate America, we could make up lies about America and do it way more efficiently than the truth. Okay, anyway, hagiography. How do you say that?
Hagiography.
Oh, hagiography. I'm dumb. I'm sorry. Okay, it says biography of saints or venerated persons. Idealizing or idolizing biography. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's definitely what some people do is just, it's called like great man history, right? When you just look at like a list of men historically who did things. That's how people used to kind of do history. So that's something I'm wary of too. That's a good point. When Trump says like restoring history, like the way that we studied history previously hasn't always been the best ways to study history, right? We're always improving on the perspectives and the lenses that we use to understand historical events. That's why history is an ongoing study. I once had a classmate joke to me like, oh, what's new in history? And then laughed and was like, haha, get it? Because nothing's new. But that's not really true. I laughed to be polite, but he was technically wrong. There's new stuff all the time. We have new understandings, new documents, new people that we want to hear from, people that have been marginalized or ignored in the past that we want to bring to light. There's a lot of work to be done in history, and especially to move away from the just looking at the founding fathers all the time. Like, doesn't that get boring? Don't you get bored hearing about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams like all the time? I'm bored of them. Let's move on. Okay, so Nicole Hannah-Jones, who founded the 1619 Project, actually, so she works for the New York Times, she tweeted, the White House Conference on American History has not a single black historian on it. Strange. Apparently its goal is, quote, the recovery of American history. Dr. Larry Arnn says, America and freedom itself are at stake. Interesting concept. Big audience, too, about 2,400 watching right now. I think she's got so many funny things on Twitter. I think I've mentioned her a lot in my podcast. So I really appreciate you, Nicole Hannah-Jones. I know I criticized your 1619 Project maybe a little bit more harshly than I should have at first, but you know, when it comes down to it, you're doing good work. I do think it's interesting that that conference had no black historian, and I, too, am worried about the concept of recovering American history. I would say we're only just now discovering American history when we're really looking at history of enslaved people. Okay. Another tweet. Oh, a thread from Joe Streckert. He said, patriotic history isn't just factually wrong and fascist, it's also boring. That's a good point. He said, do you really want patriotic stories where good stuff just nonsensically happens? No. You want the stuff with bad decisions, fighting, and explosions. This one's funny. Okay, he keeps going. I don't love the study of history because it makes me feel good. I love it because it's full of conflict and drama. You want kids to learn about American history? Teach them the tragic, gory, and horrible stuff. That's way more compelling than bland, sentimental patriotism. One of the reasons so many people like Hamilton is because they leaned into the protagonist being an arrogant jerk who pisses off his boss, has an affair, tries to explain the affair, and messes up a lot. That's fun and interesting. And also relatable, because we all screw up. Of course, I imagine a lot of conservatives do not actually want people to learn about history, American or otherwise. They want them to internalize a mythology that fosters obedience and justifies hierarchy. That's a really interesting point, too. I think, are we really fighting between sharing new perspectives of history like the 1619 Project does with enslaved people versus only the history of white people that can be a little bit more feel-good like we used to? Or are we talking about real history versus mythologized history? Like when we talk about the Civil War versus the Lost Cause, more of a pseudo-historical narrative. Are we trying to create a mythology of America's founding? That's really what I'm worried about with this 1776 commission. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on it to see, is it even teaching history? That's my question. What's the goal here? Especially when it's politicians furthering these things. Like, they have their own goals and agendas. I mean, as they should. They're not historians. They should be doing other things. You know, that's what we voted them into office, is to not do history. We have historians for that. And so it just makes me a little wary. Okay. Dr. Carrie Lee Merritt also has a thread, and she said, I have so much to do today, but if I could write an op-ed on the way slaveholders and the Confederacy kept poor whites uneducated, illiterate, and ignorant of U.S. history to maintain white supremacy and oligarchic control. So, short thread I'll try to add to throughout the day. She posted a quote from Hinton Helper in 1857, and the quote says, "There is but one way for the oligarchy to perpetuate slavery in the southern states, and that is by perpetuating absolute ignorance among the non-slaveholding whites." And then she posted another quote by Moncure Conway in the 1850s. "The interests of slavery cannot be made at one with the interests of free society. There cannot be any legitimate institution of free society, as the free press, free speech, free school, which is not a balm for slavery." And she posted another quote from abolitionist Henry Ward Beecher. "In the South, ignorance is an institution. They legislate for ignorance the same way we legislate for schoolhouses." And then Dr. Merritt finishes off by saying, "To protect and preserve slavery, the master class understood that preventing education among poor whites helped to stifle the spread of abolitionist ideas. Illiterate or semi-illiterate, the white masses remained largely uninformed and politically apathetic. Slaveholders realized that allowing non-slaveholders to access information would disrupt their own fortunes, and thus imposed a strict system of censorship throughout the region." Man, this is really interesting stuff. This is really interesting, and this is part of the reason why I find it so important to continually reevaluate what our general understanding of history is, and other things too. I think the same can be said for education in science, like when we're dealing with the coronavirus, and we need to reevaluate what we understand about the coronavirus so that we can continue to do things that are safe, like wearing a mask, make sure you're washing your hands all the time, social distance, don't go to parties, We've had another incident at my university where lots of people wanted to go to a football game, and so they did, but they didn't social distance or wear masks, and so, that causes problems for us. And so it's like that, but with history, we have to reevaluate what we understand and what we're being told by the people around us so that we have the correct understanding, because people can use knowledge, information for their own agendas. And so if somebody tries to take a historical narrative and say, well, actually, racism hasn't really been that big of an issue in our country. It's actually not an issue. People would say, oh, okay, then we don't have to deal with it now. But that's not the truth, right? And history tells us that racism has been a big deal in our country, starting with the institution of slavery, lasting until today, as we've been struggling to undo and heal from that wound that slavery has caused in our country. And so that's why we have to continue to work to fight for equal rights, to continue to advocate for Black Americans, because, man, there's so much historically that they're dealing with. And only by understanding that history can we really be a good advocate, can we really be aware of what's needed, because we know what's been taken from them throughout the history of America. So I think, yeah, that's what it gets down to. When politicians are teaching history, they're doing so knowing that how informed or not informed we are about different historical things helps us make choices today and informs what kind of legislation we need and what we're going to advocate for today. So I do not think these things are separate. Okay, we have a few more tweets. Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, tweeted quite succinctly, "What Trump calls patriotic education is racist education." And that's not something that I've said outright in these past few minutes or so, but yeah, he's got a point. Okay, another tweet from Adam H. Dombey. He says it's called history class instead of patriotism class for a reason. Yeah, and I think that's a good point. I remember, every time patriotism and history comes up together, I keep thinking about one of these classes that I took in college called the History of Modern Latin America. And so it was a class on, Latin America and Latin American countries. This was not a U.S. history class. But America came up all of the time because apparently we've done a lot of stuff in Latin American countries. A lot of bad stuff, may I say, like instigating coups and supporting militarized governments and funding armies to go wipe out villages. Like, there's a lot of very terrible stuff. If you want to hate America, want to be anti-American, get yourself educated about what America has done in other countries. But I think it's really important to understand those things and to know that that has happened, to have a better, fuller perspective on America and a more informed understanding of what's going on in other countries and maybe why that's been the case. Anyway, maybe I should do an episode on that. That would be really interesting. Latin America. That was one of the best history classes I've had. I really, really enjoyed that one. Okay, last tweet from Jason Herbert, who does the Historians at the Movies on Twitter, I think every Sunday, which is really cool. Anyway, he said, here's my other thought. Learning about the complicated history of the United States with all the ugly parts as well as the shiny ones is about as patriotic as it gets. Coming to terms with America's past is the only way to ensure a better future. That's the best place we can leave it off. So that's all we've got so far about the 1776 Commission. I look forward to seeing what happens with this, if anything. Maybe it'll just fade out. We've got so many other things going on. So many other things. This is probably not what politicians need to be worried about right now. But hey, here we are. And every time a politician makes a comment about history, I'm here to correct them on it. So until next time when that happens, I will see you guys later. Bye.